Hi guys, today we're going to talk about literary criticism, which is reading, analyzing, and writing using different lenses. So through literary criticism, you're going to be able to see things that maybe you wouldn't have been able to see or perhaps consider before, just from doing a close reading. So, it's important to remember that the writers who are writing their ideas and sharing their thoughts with an audience aren't writing in a vacuum. Instead, they're writing within the society, and they're also taking into consideration their own life. So what that means is that the writing that an author creates is reflective on what's happening within the society as well as revealing of the author. And so literary criticism is going to allow you, as a critic, to interpret a larger meaning behind the given text, which may or may not have been intended. So there's a lot of different literary criticisms. In fact, this list is minute compared to how many there are now. And really, we're just going to focus on the main ones, which is psychoanalytic, Marxism, feminist gender, and autobiographical. And like I said, there's a lot of other ones. These are just a few, but I thought that 4 is better than trying to cover all of them. So the first one is autobiographical criticism. This is really a large reason is why we've been having different students focus on different writers throughout the course of the year so far. And so the idea of autobiographical criticism is that knowing something about the author is going to allow us as a reader to gain some type of insight about how the writing is reflective about the writer. So this could be, the writing maybe wasn't intentional. It also considers the divide between fact and fiction, the fact of the author's life, as opposed to the fiction that maybe he or she wrote. And it challenges the idea that it's impossible for one to write things completely objectively in the world of literature, because we have such intense emotions as individuals and also life experiences that the author is pretty much guaranteed to be able to write about in some way through their writing. So you can take a look at the example. So here you can see that Henrik Ibsen, we know that at the age of 8 his family slipped into poverty, and so you might be seeing up the top there what he actually went through, or the autobiographical factor. And then if one is writing a literary criticism using autobiographical criticism, then the person might write something as, here, witnessing his parents desperately selling their possessions to remain economically afloat embodies his past within the character of Nora. So this would be an example of an autobiographical criticism line. I have another example here about Arthur Miller, just sticking with The Crucible, something that you read last year. When Arthur Miller wrote the play, it was in response to the Red Scare, about the communism movement. And so down below you can see a sentence that would be written by a critic who's using an autobiographical approach. I'll give you a second to read that. So as you can see, the author may not have intended to write a little bit about their life in the writing, but an autobiographical critic would really leap on that idea. The next type of criticism we're going to look at is feminist gender. Notice that it's not, initially there's a criticism that's just feminist and then gender, but for our sense of purposes here, we're just going to combine the two. But basically this criticism is going to focus on the idea of gender, perhaps considering traditional roles that were talked about before we began reading A Doll's House, and the whole feminist movement. And another thing I wanted to point out is down at the bottom you can see a little bit of source information where you can go to for additional information. The whole intention of this slideshow is just to give you some general information, then you can decide upon which criticism you're interested in and you can dive in a little bit deeper. So let's take a look at some examples of feminist gender lines. So for example, in the novel Catch-22, which is an awesome book written by Joseph Heller during the period of World War II, there's a line taken right from the book. You can take a second to read that in quotes. And then a feminist gender critic would capitalize on the whole stereotype of a female and what they may be interested in. And so the sentence would be written in response, as you can see down below there. So really, again, focusing on the whole idea of what a female, in the eyes of the author, in the eyes of that time period, would be considering. Okay, another example you can see is Hamlet. This is, I know we haven't read that this year, but Hamlet's focusing on the protagonist, and the female characters have drawn attention, or I'm sorry, feminist critics draw attention to the female characters that are included. And you know, female characters in a lot of Shakespeare's plays are all pretty similar. So here we have the only two female characters in the play, Gertrude and Ophelia, are founded in archetypal female roles from this time period, the seductress and the weak madwoman. So capitalizing on the gender roles that are present in Hamlet. Notice there's nothing in here, as opposed to the autobiographical criticism, that's infusing anything about Shakespeare's life in here. This is specifically focusing on the female or gender issues in the play. Okay, the next one we have is psychoanalytic. Psychoanalytic is focusing on the character's psyche and infusing the study of psychological principles within literature. Sigmund Freud is probably the largest one for psychoanalytic criticism. If you've taken psychology before, then these are three terms that should sound familiar to you. And so I would encourage you maybe to consider this type of criticism. If you're not, then at least look through them and get some understanding about the id, superego, and the ego. So for example, in Frankenstein, which we should be able to get to this year, the creature is representing the superego, which is haunting and tormenting the doctor, and the doctor represents the id, trying to dismiss the creature. So the whole idea, the whole premise of a psychoanalytic critic in viewing Frankenstein would be looking at the kind of battle between the superego and the id, which results in the ego. So for example, the sentence that a psychoanalytic critic would compose would read something like, Dr. Frankenstein walks a figurative tightrope, teetering between his personal desires and his moral obligations to the creature. Another example would be in Lord of the Flies, which I know some of you have read, that Jack represents the id, who operates out of personal desire. Piggy, Simon represent the superego, and Ralph represents the ego, which is the mediator between the two. So in Lord of the Flies, Ralph serves as an allegory for the ego, mediating between self-serving forces and moral ones. So then one would take the rest of the paragraph to explore that whole idea as a psychoanalytic critic. Okay, the next one, and the last one that we have, is Marxism. Marxism critic. So that is, I think I went a little bit far. There we go. This one is going to focus on class structure and the whole how finances play a factor in in a piece of literature, and also, like I said, the class system, that everything is a result of classes and class interaction. So one could consider the socioeconomics of the character, the author, but then you have to watch that you're maintaining a difference between Marxism and autobiographical criticism. So let's take a look at some examples. So here we have in 1984, people simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registries, every record of everything you had was wiped out, your one-time existence was denied and forgotten. So a sentence under a Marxism critic would read as, the government has complete control over its citizens, effortlessly deleting their lowly existence. And then one could give some examples, perhaps citing this quote from 1984 by George Orwell. Okay, the next one we have Jane Eyre, great book. So Charlotte Bronte's hero or heroine is characterized by her class status. You can read the rest of that. Okay, so then a central focus in Jane Eyre is the focus on the social classes, because she keeps her distance from Rochester before she receives her inheritance. So again, a Marxist critic is going to focus on the structure of the class and the socioeconomics that are present in the literature or in the time period in which it was written. So here's some additional resources, and again, this literary criticism this literary criticism presentation is available to you on Moodle that you can check out under A Doll's House, because the idea is we're going to apply the practice of these different types of criticisms to the different short stories that we're taking a look at during class, and then by then you'll have a good idea, a firm understanding of all 4 of the different focus criticisms that we're going to be looking at, and then you'll be selecting one and applying it to some aspect of A Doll's House. So here's some additional different resources you can go to find some more information about any one of those criticisms. And then I also included 3 different sample essays that are literary criticisms following the ones that were talked about. So you can check those out. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you.